วัสดีค่ะ Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's Vanvira from TMA, and I'd like to welcome you once again to TMA Top Talk, which is the second time in a row this year. This time we will be meeting Mr. Pascal Morgan, the founder and CEO of Think, Speak, Transform, and board member of UTech, the European Technology Chamber. Pascal has an extensive 28 years career as former CIO, strategist, and executive for a number of Fortune 500 companies such as Coca-Cola, Deutsche Telekom, and AOL. What I like very much about today's speech is this quote: "We are on the brink of global change without a return ticket." Without a return ticket. And yes, Pascal is going to tell you that business and society will change. But what is our mission in building a better society, and how can we navigate through constant change? And I happen to know that Pascal used to live in Thailand for quite a while. And he mentioned that he would like to come back to Thailand again very much. But, we cannot let you do that this time because of this pandemic, situation. So we are very lucky today to have you with us. Why don't we, turn over this stage to you and let you begin your talk for today. Pascal, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Vanvira.
Welcome.
I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
First of all, Sawadee Krap. It's been a long time since being in Bangkok, Thailand, and I feel very honored. Thank you very much to you and to the TMA for having me here today. So thank you very much for the invitation. And I look forward on having a brief discussion with you and your dear audience on some of the aspects of innovation, transformational leadership. So what does it actually mean for us? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for our families, our communities, for society, for industries? And how do we navigate through this?
Sure, please.
Yes. So, well, first of all, thank you for joining into this conversation. And before we start, let's have a short thought around innovation. So what does innovation actually mean for us? If we look it up in the dictionary, it just says a new idea, a method, a product, something that we can actually just adapt that hasn't been evolved before or invented before. But is that really innovation? Does that actually cover some of the disruptions that we see today? What does that actually mean moving forward? I mean, we have so many different voices out there. You can hear voices from Microsoft, from Google, from IDEO, and they're all very smart. You ask 100 experts and you get 200 answers. But what does that actually mean? How do we disrupt society moving forward? So we're going to talk about technological innovation, societal innovation, also personal innovation. But before we do that, maybe I'll give you a little outline of where I come from, and then maybe understand what innovation means to me. So some 30 years ago, or almost 30 years ago, I started working at the Frankfurt Book Fair. I studied philosophy, and I was in a complete different space. I was more in the creative space. And working at the Frankfurt Book Fair, that's the world's largest book and new media exposition that's actually happening right now in Frankfurt, Germany. There at the time, I was working at the postal office as a student to finance my studies at the university. And working at the postal office meant that I saw all incoming communication. I saw all outgoing communication. And when the mail came in, I had to open up the letters and I had to put a timestamp on it. I had to sign it off. I had to make photocopies of it. To really understand, is this going to the right person, to the right department? Do I actually have to share this information with somebody else within the organization? Just to be sure that the information reaches the right person at the right time. Now, working there as a student, I found out relatively quickly about the things that work and don't work. I got to know everybody in the whole building for 1.5 years. And one day I went up to the book fair director and I said, hold on, I think your IT is not working right. And what he probably said to me was something along the lines of, Pascal, Come back later and we'll talk about it in a few months. What I heard, though, was, Pascal, great idea. Come back in 3 months, show me a concept, and we'll talk about it. And that's what I did. So 3 months later, I wrote up a 30-page concept about how to set up the IT, integrate the mainframes and midframes, set up a new whole network architecture, platform strategy, also set up the whole, there was an outbound department. I had to set up a WAN, a wide area network, to connect that actually to our internal network. And then I also launched the Book Fair CD-ROM 93, 94, and also brought the Book Fair online 94, 95. So a lot of pioneer work happened from there. And I led IT and new media product development then for 5 years. That for me was the beginning of my personal transformation. And this red thread, this golden thread, actually went through my whole life for the last almost 30 years. So leading IT at the Frankfurt Book Fair, I was on agency side, like at Pixel Park, AOL, executive in various capacities at the Deutsche Telekom. And then my last corporate gig as CIO Germany and IT Innovation Director Europe at the Coca-Cola Company. And 3 years ago, I founded my own company, Think, Speak, Transform. I think, I speak, and I help people and organizations through their own transformation challenges. I'm a proud board member of the European Technology Chamber and also chair their Academy Commission. And I'm also a member of the faculty of Future.io. And then I also have some other commitments as well with the Company Builder and also senior mentor for startups. So that said, let's put this into a larger context. And when we say context, how far do we go? Now, let's have just a very global approach. Let's put this into a global context. Now, what does it mean? I mean, after maybe 4.5 billion years of evolution of this rocky planet circling the sun, after 4.5 billion years, maybe nature is at the point of getting rid of its most pesky parasites, humankind. We're polluting our environment. What's happening with us here? What's happening with our habitat? How do we actually envision moving forward? So maybe in a few hundred millions of years, maybe there's going to be a new species, or digging up some remnants, some bones, and taking a look at our fossils. And they're saying, wow, this looks actually like a being with a large brain. It had the capability to think and to reflect. But where is it now? What happened? What actually went wrong? Let's ponder this for a second, how this can be perceived moving forward. So what happened? Did we maybe erode and destroy our habitat, as some of the pictures that you know that went around the world last year from Brazil? Did we actually maybe create technology that was so capable that it wiped us off the planet of this earth, as some visionaries say what will happen with artificial intelligence? Were we the victims of a pandemic? And right now, with the situation with Corona, that is actually something that we can actually see and feel today, that it's really a threat. Or did we maybe over-engineer ourselves? The moment, where we understand how to use CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing tools, maybe we over-engineered ourselves and we weren't fertile anymore. What actually happened? Did we actually destroy and poison our environments? As you see, like, for instance, all over the world with our plastic waste, and not knowing actually how to bring that back into our recycling systems? What happened to us moving forward? Or maybe this ancient being, humankind, wasn't that thinking. Maybe it was an aggressive species that couldn't resist to push that big red button. But that said, I don't want to be too negative. Maybe there's a different question we have to ask ourselves, a different question of navigation. And what does navigation actually mean? So let's take a step back and start thinking about innovation, what innovation means. When we think about innovation, and in my former role as CIO and IT executive in general, I mean, innovation means to get a good overview over different technologies, technologies over time and how they play. And you are very familiar probably with the Gartner hype cycles of emerging technologies. There's so many things happening, from AI, robotics, to smart dust. How do we actually understand those things? Who is giving us the compass, the guiding compass to actually find our way moving forward through this innovation space and transformation? Now, in my previous jobs, what I would do is I would always take a look for the technology drivers. What are the drivers that are really impacting change? And then we go into how to actually slice into it. But when I cluster things, I mean, this is a bit of a buzzword bingo approach, but there is a lot of merit to it. So we know that artificial intelligence and machine learning is ubiquitous technology that's going to cut through all kinds of industries. Yeah. We're going to be exploring spaces that we would not be able to tap into without using artificial intelligence. Exploring ubiquitous sensors and data, the data that's coming in, that's pouring in over our smart infrastructure and our smart networks, and collecting that data into our IoT platforms, throwing artificial intelligence into that is going to be able to develop some complete new dimensions of services, products, optimizations, production lines, and so forth. But we'll get into that in a second. There's another point when we talk about edge computing and smart dust. I'm going to have an example later on in the slides, but we know that the pendulum, within IT swings back and forth between centralization and decentralization. We've had the big time of the centralized mainframes, and then we were swinging back into the office computing space, where we had the PCs, the decentralized PCs, and then the swinging back into centralizing into the ubiquitous cloud. I know it's there everywhere, but still it's a central service that we can actually design and, create for ourselves how we actually need it, like on demand. And now, if I take a look at our end devices, we have so much computing power in these end devices, things are going back into the edge. And you just take a look at Apple's event day before yesterday with the A14 Bionic chip. We're talking about mobile devices being able to run whole machine learning frameworks on site before tapping into any cloud services. Future mobility and autonomous. I'm going to be talking about that later as well. There's a lot going to be happening, especially with the rise of urbanization. How do we actually design efficient and productive transportation routes for people, for things, for data, for products, for services? 3D and 4D printing, the whole thing around additive manufacturing. We're going to see a lot happening in that space, not only with producing plastics and material on the go, not only with creating buildings wherever we need them. There's a very interesting product and company that we have within the European Technology Chamber, where they have additive manufacturing facilities in sub-Sahara Africa, where they can build whole homes for under $20,000 as they need it, with a Lego style of building blocks moving forward. But this is also going to go into the food area. It's going to go into the organs. It's going to be able to replace things that we have lost, or it's going to be able to help us cure sicknesses. Smart and adaptive robotics, we're going to talk about that later. That's going to have a very, very strong impact on the way how we produce, the way how we live, and also on our jobs. And that said, future work and the technology of that is going to be very, very transformative. We know that 65% of our kids and our youth today are going to be working in jobs in 20 to 30 years from now that don't exist today. How do we prepare for that? And how do we integrate the technology for it? Blockchain and distributed ledger. If we start thinking about a globalized economy and a global society, knowing that me sitting here today in Munich, in Germany, and I'll be able to transact a value A with somebody that has a value B in Singapore, then all of a sudden you ask yourselves, where are the national entities? Who's going to tax? What's going to happen if one of these trading partners defaults? How do we actually move forward? But there's a lot happening there when we have machines communicating with machines over blockchain, and we don't need human interaction anymore within that communication chain. And last but not least, one of the large transformation technologies that I see is quantum computing on the rise. And you've probably heard of that. I think there's a lot of misperceptions on what quantum computing really means and how that's going to impact and transform the industries. But trust me that we're going to see a lot of impacting in the chemical and the pharmaceutical industry, but also with transportation optimization. There's going to be a lot happening there when it's about computation in a large complexity. And our world is becoming increasingly complex. So this is going to be the right time to jump on board with quantum computing moving forward. So that said, with all these technology drivers, you're probably going to ask yourself, well, thanks, Pascal, but how do I actually find my entry point into those technologies? Where do I actually begin? And there are different ways of slicing and dicing this. I mean, what I just did with you was I just started lining up some of the emerging and exponential technologies that are out there. And then we can see how these technologies will impact society, how they will impact jobs, how they will impact industries, how they impact you moving forward on developing the right strategies for your product portfolio, or for your market expansions, or for designing your productivity strategies moving forward if you need to leverage synergies. But I can also think about, clustering some of those technologies together and say, okay, how does IoT, big data, and AI, for instance, impact the whole security space? What does cybersecurity actually mean? So bringing on the crossroads of how technologies come together. I can also go into industry segments and then say, okay, let's take a look at retail. I mean, I've been in FMCG, food and beverages with Coca-Cola. There's been a lot of discussion on what's happening, for instance, within the retail space. We see a rise in automation in retail. It's not only your stores becoming more and more digital, and you look at Amazon Go, for instance, where you actually don't need cashiers anymore, and maybe then you'll use robots to fill up your shelves, but it's the whole thing around the production and the supply chain. So, for instance, using blockchain to actually trace goods back to the farm where it was produced, knowing where your mango came from, which harvest it belonged to, that also means having full quality control. But this is just an example. I can go into automotive, I can go into health, I can go into all kinds of different industry segments. But I can also take a look at cross-industry clusters. So for instance, Industry 4.0, when we bring technologies together, how they actually hit the shop floor. So automation, robotics, IoT, and big data is going to be large transformational drivers within that segment of Industry 4.0, as we know. I can also think about consolidation catalysts. So the whole space around automation, data, and analytics, to know at any given time how your factory is performing, having the right decision basis for real-time decisions and real-time delivery and real-time production. Those are very, very strong drivers that are going to transform industries for themselves as well. But I can also take a step back and say, okay, let's take a look at the macro trends. I mean, we do have some larger macro trends. For instance, in society, we have the overaging societies, especially in the Western industrial nations. We have a very strong upcoming generations in those industries that are rising. So, if we take a look at it from a European perspective, knowing that our societies are overaging, what does it mean? For instance, I take a look very often at what's happening in Africa, in continental Africa, or I go deeper into it and say sub-Saharan Africa, knowing that the median age there is below 20. What does it mean for those upcoming generations? They're going to be adapting technology differently. They're going to be leapfrogging some development stages that we went through over the last decades. They don't need to, because they can already adapt the newest technology moving forward. And they're going to have a different demand on the jobs that they're going to be working in into the future. So in that sense, there are some very large macro trends happening out there that are also going to have a very strong influence on our transformational roadmap. Circular economies, cradle to cradle, understanding how we actually use resources in a way that we can actually bring them back into the production cycle and bring them back into the product life cycle, and being resource neutral. This is a very important topic. So how can we use, for instance, technologies, map them on the 17 United Nations SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and see how we can actually then have more circular economy models that we can actually run over all kinds of different resources. What does it mean for plastics? What does it mean for CO2? What does it mean for all kinds of other resources that we're actually using there? We have to leave the exploitational path and get back into a circular path. And that's why end-to-end total cost of ownership is going to be very important, evaluating the resources that we're using. Next generation business models, there's always going to be a surprise factor. And we see that, for instance, also now with Corona impacting us globally. But there's also an intrinsic motivator there. For instance, if you look at the way how Uber has changed the transportation industry. So next generation business models have a very strong disruptive potential as well. Societal impact and feedback loops. Very important point is the way how technologies impact society, but the way how also society impacts how we develop technologies moving forward. These are constant feedback loops that we need to factor in. That means there's always going to be a moment of constant change in these kind of feedback loops. And last but not least, ethics, values, and public debate. So if we're talking about all these kind of different technologies, if we're talking about the larger macro trends, at the end of the day, you're going to have to ask yourself, what are the values that are going to guide me through this constant change? What are the elements that I would like to preserve? And what is the momentum of future innovation that I would like to capture? So it's actually weighing in both aspects. Yeah? The values that I would like to preserve and carry on, as well as the innovation momentum that I would like to capture in going into a new future, right? But at the end of the day, we all as a global society, but also as national societies out there that are increasingly more interconnected, yeah, we need to have this candid debate on the ethics and the values that are going to guide us into the future. So that said, and I know it's a very strong intro that we're having here because we're actually going to continue our conversation and looking at a couple of other aspects. I'm asking myself increasingly, are we getting lost in this world of increasing complexity? And you're probably familiar with some of the things that have been happening around AI and around visuals and around visual, let's say, manipulation around deepfakes. We see all these deepfakes that are hitting us today. Sometimes we don't even know, is this actually really a Twitter bot? Or is this a real person? Is this a fake account? Or is this really somebody in the flesh that is out there sharing their opinion? We are getting lost in this. On the positive note, we also see what's happening, for instance, what some of the larger companies are developing, like Facebook has actually just launched this prototype with an AI that can actually go into a 2D image, into a film image, and recognize the object that is in that image, and then actually be able to, extract a 3D object around it, and with the right AI algorithms behind it, can actually foresee what kind of object this is and how it will move and how it will behave. So it can give this object specific attributes just from a 2D image, something that we think is normal for us humans that we can do, but AI is already there as well. Now, there's another example that I like talking about, especially when I said I'm coming from the creative space 30 years ago. I mean, I love doing music, and I still do. But we see the way how AI in the creative industry is developing. And please check out, if you have the time, IVA Technologies. It's really interesting, some of the pop, some of the rock compositions, but also classical compositions or film music. You hear fine instruments from, your violins, your wood sections, and your brass section. Very, very impressive. As a musician, I'm almost sad that I can't play that good. But what really shocks me is not the way how AI actually is producing music, but the crazy aspect actually is you can order it online. You can subscribe to this. So this is not about AI performing so well. This is actually about the Amazonization of AI. So you can buy this for cheap money. And then I ask myself as a musician, hold on, what is the impact for the creative industry moving forward? Do we still need musicians? And we also know, the examples within Facebook. several years ago, where they actually had two AI bots that were actually negotiating with each other on something very mundane. It was about, books, hats, and balls, and they had, different objects, and they were going to negotiate with each other on who should get which part. And after a while, those two bots, they just chopped up the syntax. The Facebook engineers didn't understand anymore what those two bots were actually communicating with each other and had to pull the plug. So AI is becoming increasingly more independent. And we all know the examples, of AlphaGo and AlphaGo Zero, and also, beating the world champions in Go. The interesting aspect for me is not so much like what we saw, for instance, with IBM actually beating Kasparov in chess in 1997. The same thing is happening again, beating a very good human player on champion level. The thing is that the AI is training itself. So we see after 40 days, AlphaGo Zero was already playing in a championship level that was already unbeatable by training itself. This seems like an exotic aspect, but don't forget last year, IBM launched IBM NewNets, which was actually an AI framework that can go back into like its own library of neural networks and configure itself, looking at the problem and trying to figure out what is the best way to solve this problem, and can actually optimize itself moving forward. This is happening already today. And another example, and it's just over the last few weeks taken a very interesting turn. Last year, there was GPT-2 launched, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It's actually an AI platform that you can actually feed it with a sentence, and that's what I actually did. I typed in a sentence: artificial intelligence could be one of society's largest, and that's where I stopped. And this AI is, I think, trained with around 1.5 billion parameters. And the thing is, it actually completed my sentence on the fly without knowing what I wanted to achieve. And I was thinking of more of an optimistic approach for my presentation to say one of society's largest, impulse factors or change factors or transformation factors. But no, it went on to write, contributors to the rise of a new form of fascism, a study claims. Researchers from the University of Michigan and Stanford have examined whether human-like artificial intelligence can be used to create a new generation of totalitarianism. And this is something I did not expect, but that's what it came up with just by using some of the data that's out there. GPT-3, the successor of this, was launched this summer in a closed beta. And as far as I understood, I think Microsoft is securing its rights to GPT-3. And this was actually then trained on 175 billion parameters. So it's going to be much, much stronger. In the future, we will not know if this book, not only a nonfiction, but also fictional novels, is written by an AI or by a human being. But there are other examples out there, like, for instance, IBM has launched, Project Debater last year. That was actually an AI that could debate with a human on top level. In this case, the human debater, it was Harish. He's a world champion in debating, very, very intelligent man. They were briefed 15 minutes before the show, only 15 minutes, on whether or not states, governments should subsidize preschools, so children will have, equal chances when they go into school later on. A very dry topic, a very abstract topic, and Project Debater did a very good job debating this with Harish live on stage. But let's take a step back. We all know what's happening, in the public space. And right now we're seeing the presidential elections in the United States, and there's a lot happening there. If I just, turn the clock back, 2016, the last presidential debate, we already saw a lot of things happening, for instance, on Twitter, where AI supports your own space, your own likes, your own preferences. And then all of a sudden, you only see the topics that you want to see. And what happens is that people stay within their bubbles. Why? Well, we know that the magic word is bias. And bias is something, it's about systems that humans make. And humans are biased. And there's going to be bias in the data. And we've seen that actually being expressed very extremely in the US, where a Florida county court actually used an AI as a prototype to actually evaluate, the risks of falling back into crime when they looked at the criminal records of delinquents. And, coming in front of the court, and the AI was evaluating and took like a low risk to high risk approach. And I'm just going to take a look. I mean, these were petty crimes that were brought to the court at that moment, talking like, shoplifting, these kind of things. And they took a look. I'm just going to take a look at the two in the middle with Dylan and Bernard. We see that a low risk 3 and a high risk 10. And you look at the criminal records with the low risk with 1 attempted burglary, and then 3 drug possessions as a subsequent offenses. And at Bernard's is only 1 resisting arrest without violence and no subsequent offenses. Where I would say, as a human, it should be the other way around. But no, there was something that actually the AI factored in, and that was, of course, ethnicity, and background. And in that sense, we know that if there's bias in the data, AI does not create bias, but it will definitely strengthen it and expand it. And that is something we need to be very, very aware about. But it's not only about data and algorithms, it's also about, accelerating processing power. So the whole hardware industry is working on that as well. And we see a lot of different hardware developments out there gaining speed. So, NVIDIA is one of the big companies out there. They're also very active in the automotive space and autonomous driving, developing the hardware platforms for their to be integrated into the cars as well. We have Google out there with their own TPU framework, relying a lot on third-party developments. So that's their TensorFlow strategy. But we also have a very interesting aspect on the side with the neuromorphic from Intel. Intel is trying to, let's say, emulate the way how the brain functions, our own brains. And their latest release actually this year was their Pohjoki springboards featuring the low-heat chips, equivalent to 100 million neurons. That's around 90 billion synapses. And to put this into context, 100 million neurons, small insects that are able to navigate themselves through a complex space like a room, they run on sometimes less than 1 million neurons. And we're able to emulate 100 million here as well. But don't forget, we still have a long ways to go to understand the human brain, because the human brain in itself has around 86 billion neurons. That's equivalent to 100 trillion synapses. So we still have a way to go there. But the development is very impressive. Now, going forward, that said, with the human brain, we're going to tap into things like human augmentation. What does it actually mean when humans and technology come together? We're seeing a lot of things happening. Just a couple of weeks ago, Elon Musk had a press conference with the next generation Neuralink integrations, actually these small chips that you can integrate into your brain and create an interface between the sensors and your neural pathways. And he presented, the live testing with pigs, and also this larger unit that would actually automate the operation to integrate a chip into your brain. It sounds like spooky science fiction, but there's a lot happening in that space, because if you think about how do I approach dementia, and I mentioned before the societal macro trends of an overaging society, how do you actually start tackling some of those health issues that are going to be very prevalent for us in the future? Maybe this is a way out. We do not know. But the whole thing around neural dust and neural chips has been around a lot. So the UC Berkeley has been doing a lot of research with their neural dust strategies moving forward. And I mentioned before the whole thing around miniaturization and talking about neural chips. Things are getting smaller, and you've probably seen some of the things that IBM has produced as an example here with their smart dust chip. What you see on the tip of this finger is actually a die. It's like a chip out of a wafer, but it's a die. That means this consists actually of 64 chips. So if you break away one of those 64 chips, you're going to see a little speck on that pile of salt. And don't forget, in that little speck, this tiny little chip, we already have around 300,000 units that can actually compute. We have a battery. We have a little solar unit that can recharge the battery, and we have a little photonic unit that can actually send out light signals, so the chips can actually communicate with themselves. So that said, we're on the level with a computing power of a Pentium from 1990, 1991, 92. Yeah. So don't forget this on this tiny little smart chip. So maybe in the future, in a few years from now, if I want to speak fluent Thai, yeah, and I'll just take that chip and maybe dissolve that into my tea and drink that, and I'll be able to speak a language of my choosing. But that said, human augmentation also means, replacements. Yeah. So how does it actually, look like if we have a damaged limb? And there have been some studies out there and some questions out there willing to trade in a physically normal limb that is not defect for a bionic limb that can do much more. And surprisingly, there are a few that will take that into consideration. But, talking about, treating accidents, talking about treating illnesses, there's a lot happening in that space. But we see robotics even today. This is one example that we have here in Germany with Franca Emica, with 7 degrees of freedom, with ease of use of programming. You can scale your factory floor within just 10 minutes once you have programmed visually programmed this device. You can scale that to 10,000 arms just by a click, and you can actually then start automating your whole production flow. Yeah, robotics have already entered also our personal spaces. Last year, this was an award. This Lovat, this cuddly little robot, won an award in the U.S. At the CES in Las Vegas. These things are happening with the cuttable. This also is very interesting for treating dementia patients in elderly homes, right? But also, taking on some very interesting tasks. We see the Atlas here on the lower left. You've probably seen some videos around that can actually do a salto from out of its stand. We also know with Spot, our little robotic dog, that is actually also being sold, I think, for a price of $75,000. Can carry, I think, around 14 kilograms, but it's actually very well equipped to go into spaces that humans can't go. And then, of course, with Asimov from Honda, Pepper, but there are a lot of different robotic examples out there. So we know whatever can be digitized will be digitized. It's one of those slogans from the 90s. And we're seeing that happening increasingly. So translating that into the workforce, into the jobs of the future, what does that actually mean? According to McKinsey, we know that, from the low skill labor and the low product complexity jobs that, 3/4 to 80% of the jobs can be automated. The hours that are spent on these jobs can be automated. And I just select, the top 3 within that industry segment of, the low complexity jobs. We also have, the mid and the high complexity jobs, and just the top 3 of those. And we know that also with the medium skill, the medium complexity jobs, that still, a good 2/3 to 3/4 of those hours can be automated. But even if we call us as part of the knowledge community within society and within the industries, even our jobs, a good 1/3 to half of the jobs can be automated. And the examples, like, for instance, in South Korea, of having an AI at the board table of directors, making the decisions on where to actually invest their funds into which startups. An AI sitting there and bringing in their opinion on where to actually invest. So making complex decisions in a complex environment, AI sometimes is better equipped than a human being. And this is something that is probably going to happen to us. So question is, while AI is taking more and more into that, going into that space, what is happening with us and what is happening with humans? And are we transforming into machines caught up in the gig economy or doing, some of the menial works? And at the same time, we actually see machines transforming into humans. That means we are faced with a lot of change. And what does change mean? Maybe you've heard of a term that's coming out of the military space with VUCA, with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So yes, our system, our environments are very volatile. We're at tipping points right now. We see it with the climate impact. Yeah, we see it with some of the industries. We see it with the impact on the job, space. Yeah, so our systems are becoming increasingly volatile, increasingly coming to the tipping point. Uncertainty means we don't have enough data. We don't really understand what's happening in our environment. Yeah, so our environment is increasingly complex and producing a lot of data. And sometimes that data, if we do have some, it can mean multiple things. It's ambiguous, just to understand what VUCA means. But as is, William George from the Harvard Business School, he had actually a very interesting retranslation of the term VUCA. We're saying, like, to help with this moving forward is to have a good vision on where do you want to go. Have a solid understanding of the environment that you're in. Have the courage to make bold decisions, right? And to be flexible to adapt. And that means we need to understand how we start with building the right culture in our companies and in our environments moving forward. Otherwise, we will not be able to create a disruptive and a sustainable customer experience moving forward. Culture, people, processes, platforms, products, engagement, and customer experience. What do you need in your companies? So if you're strategists and decision makers and leaders in your companies, there are different roles that you actually need. In my experience, what I've always worked on is that you need a facilitator that creates transparency with that information, bringing information into the company and making it available to all. You need a magnifier that says, okay, let's take a look at some of those opportunities, and see to it that I actually find the right persons within the organization. My sales teams, marketing teams, and product development teams, my finance teams. Yeah. I also need enablers that say, okay, I'm going to provide the learning platforms, the exchange platforms, and I'm going to be able to provide the tools and the trainings within the company to move forward. And at the end of the day, I also need the owner, the one that takes full product and loss responsibility for product and service and runs with it. Yeah, entrepreneurship, intrapreneurship, spinning in, spinning out. These kind of roles in that spectrum is going to be very crucial if you want to transform your business forward. But there are very, very many ways that lead to Rome, different ways to set up your innovation funnel, and your innovation strategy, from Scrum and Agile designs all the way to moonshot thinking. There are different ways to approach this moving forward, and there's not one size that fits all. What's very important is that you actually acquire your early adopters, your innovators and early adopters, that you understand how to actually reach out to them. You have to have the will to be able to fail, to learn fast, to fix it fast, and try again. Those innovators and early adopters are going to be the most expensive customers to acquire, but the most rewarding in the long run, on the long road. Some of you coming from economics, you know the marketing mix, with your 4 Ps, your product, price, promotion, and placement. And it's a very valid toolbox. It is still very valid moving forward. And I can only, commend you all if you have a good strategy based on those 4 Ps. But the times are changing and we need a mind shift. Yeah. So if I take a look at these and if I say, okay, let's put people in the center of things, and I put purpose to that center of things and say, people matter. It's a people's business, a people's society, and purpose is important. What am I doing that is relevant for me? what is relevant to my family, to my community, to my society, yeah, then all of a sudden things change. Your product becomes a solution. Your price becomes value. Yeah? Your promotion becomes education. And your placement actually becomes access. Just let that sink in for a moment as just an example for mind shift and mind shift change. The same thing also with Porter 5 forces. Yeah, just you can use the same way to approach this, and you're probably very, very familiar with that. It's basics in your economics to understand your competitive landscape. But even there, I would just really recommend this mind shift change to put your single-minded solution in the center of things. What I mentioned before with people and purpose is here the same thing as well. And if you look back, I mentioned this whole thing. Well, I'm just going to pick out one, like threat of substitution on the bottom. All of a sudden, that changes to constant evolution. Why? Because your threat of substitution, knowing that somebody else is going to, come into your market and there's something else that has the potential of substituting your product and service, becomes your trigger, your motivation, your intrinsic motivation to constantly evolve and to become better. And that's something you can do with all of these components here. So constant evolution, what does it actually mean moving forward? I'll give you an example here. 1995, somebody had the idea to sell books online. Today, we have Amazon with a revenue of $280 billion. 1945, this was a company that sold vegetable oil and household oil to households. Today, Wipro, the IBM of India, as they say, with 175,000 employees. Another example, 1927, a textile company in the USA. And today, Berkshire Hathaway, actually the big investment company of Warren Buffett, with an own revenue of $247 billion in 2018. Another example, 1889. This was a company in Japan that was specialized on game cards. And today, actually, Nintendo that brought us Super Mario that we all know, and grew up with. 1871, an example here, this is a paper mill factory. And today, Nokia. We know it as a mobile company, but actually today, one of the two very important European companies for infrastructure. And the last one, just as an example, 1850, you can already see the name in the picture, was actually a company that was founded to deliver express mail across the US. And today, it's American Express. And we're using Zoom today, right? Aren't we? So, a couple months ago, Zoom was like, rocketing in the Corona crisis. And it had, this picture went around, you're probably familiar with it, had a market evaluation of $46 billion, more of some of the selected largest airline carriers out there. And to be honest with you, last Sunday, I checked the market evaluation, where we're at $140 billion. Disruption can be unexpected. So what is coming our way? Yes, I see AI is coming our way. It's going to impact our workforce moving forward. I see automation is coming our way. That's going to actually make us question what work is in the future. I see, 3D printing, additive manufacturing, printing organs and body parts moving forward. It's a two-sided, story. I see, the whole thing around the demographic shift that I mentioned before. That's coming our way and it's going to be impacting us. I see the whole trend around urbanization is going to be a very, very large, important factor. By 2050, we need to feed 10 billion people, and 2/3 of those are going to be living in urban environments. I see blockchain impacting our industries moving forward and transforming our whole transactional space. I see there's a large geopolitical situation and a lot of friction moving forward. And, we have the BATs in Asia and China, especially in China now with the Baidu's, Alibaba, Tencents, and we have the GAFAs, the Google, Amazon, Facebooks in the US, and we have Europe somewhere squeezed in between, not knowing where to invest and to move forward. We have an issue with our waste management. Moving forward, talking about circular economy is very relevant. We have a very strong impact by climate change. that's going to influence us. I also see some frightening developments also with talking about geopolitics and also warfare of smart drones and smart machines. That is something we're going to have to understand today so we can actually create the frameworks of managing that in the future. And of course, last but not least, something I'm very passionate about is quantum computing. Space travel, it's very hyped, it's coming our way, but I think we should try to fix our planet first. But that is going to be a very big inspirational driver. But whatever we do, we need to not forget what's most important to us and what we need to invest in, and that is our children. We have a moral obligation to provide them a future, to provide them a society and an environment they can strive and grow in. Yeah? And that is something I would really, really like to give you within this speech, to have that as part of your moral compass moving forward. We need to be looking at ourselves. What can we do to move forward? So if you ask me about like the 3 rules of leadership through change, and then I'm going to close off on that. 3 rules of change. It sounds a bit like, the 5 recipes how to get rich. No, I would really like to have more of a personal answer on that, not so much your meta level, your calendar quote approach. For me, 3 rules of leadership moving forward. Number 1 is flexibility. Yeah, there's not one size fits all, and there's not going to be an answer carved in stone that's going to carry us into the next 20, 30, 40 years moving forward. There's too much happening out there. We really need to understand what it means to be flexible. In Denmark, for instance, they developed this chaos pilot program for educating leaders of tomorrow. Being able to navigate through chaos means you need to be flexible. Honesty. And honesty for me is really about having a candid approach and taking a look at ourselves, taking a look at a business, at society, at face value, and see what that really is about. Collecting the data and being honest about this data and making the right decisions based on that. And then last but not least, something very important is purpose. I mentioned the whole thing around your moral and your ethical compass, is to invest into those things. You invest your time, your resources, your passion, your dedication into those that have purpose. And if there's no purpose, it's time to change. Yeah. So in that sense, flexibility, honesty, and purpose, I know those are very, very big topics and terms and headlines, but it's always valuable and always rewarding to take some time to reflect on those and to reflect on what you're doing today and see how you can design, co-create a desirable future moving forward. So that said, thank you very much, Kap Makap, for listening, and on to you, Sing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pascal Morgan, for an insightful talk. Well, I wish it's truly beneficial to all of us and our guests as well. Well, we are now having some questions from our audience. So may I have the first question, please? The first question is many people focus on the benefits of technology, well, digital and AI, and how should we prepare ourselves to the security, well, let's say privacy? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, thank you very much. That's a very good question. And it's going to be hard to answer that question within our session, because I think that is something where you can fill like 2 days of conversation and workshops with, because it's a multidimensional challenge that we have, especially around privacy, around data, and around AI. We have a lot of benefits moving forward. So for instance, I had a conversation with a startup recently on developing AI solutions to predict your health situation and the medication that you're taking, and to predict your scenario moving forward in the next 5 to 10 years, and if you need to change some of your medication moving forward. On the other side, yes, if we have examples of AI going through all of this data and being able to predict exactly where you are at a given time, do you want that, right? So but it's also a question about values. So things like in Europe, where we say we are very, very sensitive to data privacy, and we are starting to develop our services around privacy by design. In China, they have a different approach on that, right? And they say for them, smart city and smart infrastructure needs to know where every person is. So having that conversation, that intercultural conversation, and to say, you know, where are your moral standards? Yeah, and how to actually deal with that means that on a political, on a societal, on a public level, we need an honest conversation about governance. Yeah, who owns the data? Who governs the data? How do we deal with that? And how do we secure our citizens? That's just as an inspirational answer. We can drill down on that maybe for the second or third session.
So it's also depends on the governance as well, right?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, well, we have another question. It's about the innovation. What might be the most important innovation that you expect to happen in the next few years, and what would impact us?
Well, so I'm right now, I'm a little bit hesitant. Yeah, no, it's yeah, it's absolutely a good one, but it's an important question, and I just had an outline in my presentation on the different technologies that I see out there, and in the very beginning I started off with the technology drivers, and those for me are the big innovations, and there was a reason why I had artificial intelligence in the beginning and quantum computing at the end, because for me those are the big two disruptors that are so extreme that we do not know how society and industries are going to change beyond that. It's what sometimes you call the point of singularity, right? So we cannot see beyond those timeframes because things can change exponentially in one way or the other. So those, and everything else in between are for me incremental disruptors. Automation, robotics, smart dust, you know, they are going to change industries and society in specific ways. But the big disruptors is AI and quantum computing for me moving forward. But I have an expectation and I have a wish that the big innovation is going to be is that we as people understand what our human values are, that we work together as an integrated society and start designing our desirable future and not letting technology decide our future and our fate.
Right. Wow. That's what about, well, as you mentioned, in desirable future. And what about the impact on organization culture? Well, and do you have any example that you would like to elaborate on cooperation transformation into innovation-oriented culture? Any example?
No, thanks for that question. That's a very good question, and it's also a very tough one because there's a lot of detail to it, right? Because it's always easy to have, like, you know, your C-level speech, or you have all the employees gathered together in a town hall, and then you have this great speech on, we want people to have more entrepreneurship spirit. And then a lot of employees, they stand there and go like, what does that mean for me? What am I supposed to do? This is not my company. I don't own any shares. Why should I start thinking like an entrepreneur? Yeah. What are the expectations towards me? And what my experience is that a lot of employees, they feel overburdened and they don't really understand what do they need to do to go on this transformation path. We always pray, we always, preach to them, say, you need to be more innovative. But it's actually our responsibility as leaders is to create an environment that fosters innovation. And there are a couple of components around that I would really like to underline. I think number one is that we have a more failure tolerant culture and environment within our companies and our businesses. Yeah, it's okay to fail if you understand how to learn, fix it, and restart again, right? It's also the question around, how you deal with decision-making processes. Yeah. Do you have a very hierarchical kind of siloed divisional approach, or do you have more, lean management, flat hierarchies, agile teams? You're talking about, business scrum and IT development scrum. There are different ways how you can actually design and plan your organization, but it all starts with culture. I was very brief on that aspect, but that is something you can also fill several days with, is how can you infuse innovation thinking with people? It's a very personal experience. You bring them into workshops, you bring them into, mind-opening sessions, you listen to them, you see, you tap into their creativity, you give them, the spirit and the space to express themselves and to actually have a candid conversation of what they would like to change in their working environment, right? At the same time, it's also from the C-level position, is that, the decision makers need to understand what innovation really means. Yeah. And if I'm working in a company, in an industry that is about to change, I need to be able to embrace that, and try to understand how I can actually redesign my organization to go along that path. Yeah. But it's absolutely important. It starts with people. And if I'm not able to inspire my employee, and I'm talking about every employee, I'm not talking about my top managers or my middle management, I'm really talking about my lower entry junior manager people. Yeah, even the janitor in my company. Yeah, if I don't understand the way how that all fits in together, it's going to be hard to transfer that business moving forward.
So it's like the whole organization should have the perspective on transformation.
But it's easier said than done. So I'm very aware of that. So, you need data, you need insights, you need to understand how your business is really working. You need to understand your market and your customers, right? But differently. It's not like, a very sequential approach. I do my market assessment, I develop a product, and then I deliver the product, and then I wonder, oh, wow, the market has already changed in the meantime, or I did not understand the customer life cycle, right? If you're talking about design thinking, for instance, I mean, there are different ways and different tools on how you can actually, develop a disruptive customer experience. And again, I want to loop that back. Customer experience and being disruptive is one thing, but it's also important to be sustainable, right? Because in 20 or 30 years from now, if I develop a new soft drink, it's not going to be relevant if it's not sustainable, ecologically, socially, and from a governance perspective.
Well, as you mentioned that using data and doing business and also using technology in developing new products for production, let's say. And have you ever curious that is there any kind of totally new job that never existed before and will exist in the next 30 years?
That's a very good question. I love it. No, because two very dear friends of mine are working on. They've developed this Future Game 2050 model. If you're on LinkedIn, please look it up. I love it. They're absolutely creative people. But the thing is, they're actually thinking about future jobs, right? Yeah. So it's like things you can think of, like your AI therapist, right? So it's a therapist for the AI, because the AI is encountering problems that it can't solve itself, right? And it needs somebody. It sounds funny, right? But just to think of it, you already start noticing there's something to it, right? So what does it actually mean if you want to provide services? Well, let's say, for instance, also your 3D printer, your organ designer, right? And you're replacing a heart, or you're replacing an arm, or you're replacing a leg, yeah? And you start redesigning that organ to actually integrate other features into it, right? So I think there are going to be jobs out there that are going to be very different to the jobs today. But we shouldn't forget, not all jobs that we have today are going to exist in the future, not only in the job skills, but also in the number and the volume of jobs. So if we see an automation impact of 2/3, maybe we'll be able to compensate 1/3 with new jobs. And half of those, that first third is going to change also into this new kind of job level. What do we do with those that are impacted by automation? Yeah. Do we have universal basic income, or what happens there?
Right. Well, thank you very much. Well, we have some few questions from the audience. Wow, this one is quite interesting. When people say about being agile is to fail fast and learn to fake it's fast about when we talk about NPD process. Well, somehow we may not be able to fail that often due to the high investment of reinvesting and investing in a new thing. So how can we mitigate risks and learn not to fail that often?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's a question about being real, because we also hear that very often. You have to be agile, fail fast. But the thing is, your budgets are going to be absorbed, right? And we're not always constantly living in a bubble where you have a lot of VC money being thrown at you, and people don't care how much you're burning because the next unicorn is going to save that. No. You're absolutely right with that question. So agility in itself, actually, I do not really understand that as a failure culture per se, that you fail a lot. It's about failing early and failing fast so that you have the data available. You always have to track your prototypes, right? And that you can iterate quickly and adapt to that iteration and then continuously improve, right? So that is a slightly different approach. With investments, this is something that needs to be decided from the very beginning and also top level to say, if I have an organization that a part of my resources are allocated either directly or as a buffer to actually absorb some of those failure cycles to learn and to adapt, because the rewards are going to be higher than in the future. If I fail too late in my process, I'm going to burn too much money. I'm going to burn my marketing money, my branding, I'm going to burn my product development, and even my customers, right? So if I fail very early and quickly, the investments are actually not going to be as high as if I fail too late, right? And so, but that's an organizational question. I need to be able to iterate quickly. So I need an agile organization, and I need a top-level sponsoring with an allocated amount of money or buffer, or let's say virtual buffer, yeah, so the organization can try things out. Yeah, and there are a lot of examples out there, like for instance, Volkswagen or even Google started that years ago, where you have like, okay, if a person has a good idea that and can win other colleagues and peers to support that idea, this person can get 20% off their time and actually invest that into developing a new product model, and then take it then there into the next decision cycles with management. But there are different ways to approach it, but it's a very, very valid question.
Right, thank you very much. Well, as we have a time limit, well, let's come to the last questions, which is seems talking about world population will, as it seems to grow up to 10 billion in the future. However, the jobs are being replaced with various tech and automations. Well, as we've heard a lot about, job has been replaced by AI. So what do you think about that? Do you have any suggestion? How can we like reskill, upskill?
Yeah, so I was trying to touch on that briefly in my presentation, and it's a very valid question. And I love the question because that's going to be an ongoing challenge. But we need to start thinking about that today, and we need to start decisions today moving forward. Because, our children are in schools that are learning a curriculum that actually has been signed off 2 generations ago, or it's a second generation teachers that are teaching the teachers now that are teaching our children. So long story short, we need to start changing now to understand what's going to happen in the future. Yes, what do I see coming? What you just mentioned. Is that going to be the basis for the universal basic income? I don't know, but it looks like it. Yeah. Um, do I think Bill Gates is right that we can tax robots? I don't think so, right? But I think our economic systems might need some reflection on how they are going to change because, in our value chain, we cannot always create value on the next step if we have everything automated and humans are not part of this process anymore. If humans are only at the end on the consuming cycle, then the whole value chain is going to collapse, right? Just from an economical perspective. So the question is, how do we create value because people need jobs in the current understanding of our economic system so they have money or value that they can trade in for that what they consume. So it's a tricky question. So universal basic income, yes, we need to rethink the way how society functions. Yes, we need to understand the way how urban environments work. Yeah. So, have, for instance, vertical farming, food production on site. Yeah. Local environments. I mean, that's going to be something very important that we have local cycles and local systems, yeah, replenishing themselves. Yeah. So I think we have some challenges there that I'm not too positive about. But at the same time, I'm a very positive person, and I believe in us being able to tackle those challenges. But it's going to be a little bit of a piecework moving forward.
All right. Thank you very much. Well, actually, we have lots more questions that, it's impossible that we will let you answer it later. Okay.
Yeah, maybe we need another second or a third session for that. Happy to speak with TMA again.
Pleasure for me. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And on behalf of TMA and our distinguished guests, I wish to express my sincere appreciation and thankfulness to Mr. Pascal Morgan. Thank you once again.
Yes, thank you very much, and I feel very honored for the innovation or the invitation. I want to say innovation. That's innovative too, absolutely. But thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to the TMA. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, and happy to continue our dialogue in the future. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And before we go, I would like to invite you to the upcoming TMA Talk Talk, which will be held on November the 5th on 2020 under the topic Artificial Intelligence, the Transformer by Mr. Pablo Rodriguez, founding CEO of Telefonica Alpha. And please scan the QR code on the screen for registration, or you can contact TMA for more details. And we have now come to the end of TMA Talk, Technology and Society, Innovation, Transformations, and Leadership. I would like to express our appreciation to our strategic partner, Thailand Convention and Exhibition Bureau, and our generous sponsors, Bank Public Company Limited, Beta Grow Public Company Limited, Thai Beverage Public Company Limited, and Thai Oil Public Company Limited that have been such a great support. I also would like to seek your cooperation in completing the evaluation form by scanning the QR code on the screen. Your feedback is essential to us as we can continue to improve our programs and services to you. Finally, TMA would like to express our appreciation to all of you for joining us today. Have a good evening. สวัสดีค่ะ